Thanks, Annie. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a great break. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As usual, I can make these slides available to you after my presentation today. But as Annie mentioned, it would be good if you could have something to either handwrite with or be able to type, because there will be some spots in the presentation today in which I'll explicitly ask you to jot down things that are standing out to you, although of course I welcome you to do that throughout the presentation. So as Annie mentioned, this was a presentation I gave at the Michigan Reading Association. I was asked to deliver it to the network. I have changed some things in it. So even if you were at MRA, I don't think it will be too redundant, hopefully. Anyway, for better or worse, here it comes. Here's the description from the MRA program. Okay, all righty. So I am going to do some terminology work briefly. I think many of you know what I mean by these terms, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page to start. And then I'm going to talk about three major connections between effective instruction and equity. There are more than three. Three is what I felt I had time to do. So that's how many I'll discuss, and then give you a good opportunity to work together about moving forward around these issues. So what is science of reading? As many of you know, for me, this term means a convergence of findings from research on reading. For me, science of reading includes reading processes, that is what's happening in a reader's mind as they're reading, and then also reading instruction, that is what has scientific research shown us is more or less effective instructionally, and implementation, so factors that affect the ways in which reading instruction plays out in different contexts. So things like research on coaching, for example. So that's my view of what science of reading means. I absolutely acknowledge that lots of people are using this term to mean something not this. So just to be very clear, science of reading is not a program. It's not some professional development thing you can do, or it's not a specific practice like sound walls. It's not a narrow subset of instructional foci like only phonemic awareness and phonics. That's not what science of reading means, in my opinion. And also, I know you all know this, but just a reminder that, just because somebody's talking about the science of reading, even talking about it in a really confident or really like strong way, that doesn't actually mean that they're knowledgeable about the science of reading. In fact, I recently wrote a book foreword in which I was applauding the author's use of terms like based on our knowledge so far, or as far as I can tell from the research to date, or thus far research suggests. And I was praising that because that's how scientists talk. Scientists actually tend to be tentative about, conclusions, and sort of like really strong, unequivocal, not open to revision, dogmatic statements are actually not really part of the discourse of science. So it always strikes me like odd when I'm hearing those being invoked in the context of science, if that makes sense. Anyway, okay, effective instruction. What do I mean there? Instructional practices that research suggests have better effects than alternative practices. Basically. So sometimes when we talk about instructional practices that are effective, we're talking about practices that have been tested in a lot of different kinds of contexts, lots of different classrooms with lots of different groups, and like consistently they seem to be more effective. Sometimes when we're talking about effective instruction, those practices haven't been tried with every group or in a wide range of contexts, and that is important to keep in mind. In the essentials, we've tried to focus on practices in general that have quite a bit of research support so far. Okay, equity. This is a discussion of equity that I really appreciate, so I'd love to give you a chance to just read this. So there are many things in this short discussion here that I think are important in defining equity, but certainly an important one is each of us getting what we need. So it's not everybody getting the same thing. It's each person getting the thing or things that they need in order to be successful. And this notion of, equity having to do with people's and children, family, and communities' goals feels really important, what they're trying to achieve. And I also think this concept of full potential is, or actualized potential or the like, is very useful and connects very much to things that you've heard Dr. Muhammad talk about as well. So I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like in the field, the conversations about equity and about science of reading often feel very separate to me, like different people are having them. It's a different discourse. It's sort of a different, emphasis and so on. And as you know, the point of this presentation is to suggest that that's off, that in fact, these two sets of ideas are inextricably linked, at least as I define them. So the first area where I'm going to talk about connections between effective instruction and equity is in the area of relating the new to the known and culturally responsive teaching. So relating the new to the known is a term that you've probably heard me or Tanya or others use. It's been around a long time. I'm actually not sure really where it exactly started. Anyway, relating to new to the known, I'm arguing relates to culturally responsive teaching. So when we think about pedagogy for equity, culturally responsive teaching is one of the first things that probably we think about as very important. And what I'll argue is that there are ways in which culturally responsive teaching relates very closely to scientific research on effective instruction, and particularly on the relating the new to the known concept. So more about that. Okay. So let's imagine that you've got a student or students in a classroom and they are learning words that are unfamiliar to them. And those words are silo and crops. So research suggests that if you're teaching children silo and crops, what you're seeing on the screen might be a very good way to do that. So you're not just like giving a definition of silo and giving a definition of crops, but rather you're placing those words into a larger context, relating them to words that may be familiar. For example, children may not be familiar or aren't in this scenario familiar with the term silo, but they're familiar with the term barn. They may not be familiar with the term crops, but they may be familiar with some of these examples of crops or familiar with farms as also a place that raises animals. And so what you're doing is you're placing the new information into a web of known information. And this technique has been around literally for decades as a way of teaching vocabulary. What we've learned in more recent years is that this is pretty much how information is organized in the brain. So what we now know is that for example, if you present somebody with the word crops, they're going to more quickly identify soybeans and animals as, say, real words than if you were to put like elephant and doorway. So in other words, we have these different experimental paradigms that allow us to understand that semantic networks are used in the brain to store information and vocabulary. So let's try this out a little bit together. So the word here is effervescent. And I want you to imagine that you were going to teach the word effervescent to a group of children in a research supported way. Could you say in the chat some of what you might say or do to teach effervescent? So far I'm seeing bubbly and soda and fizzy. maybe teaching some morphology, seeing soda listed again. You all are not seeming as Michigan-y, because I would think you would have written pop. So that's funny. Two different words for the same thing used in different parts of the country. Alka-Seltzer, develop a kid-friendly definition, picture of things bubbling. Great. I'm not going to read all of this, but yeah, all very lovely. So in what you're doing here, you are presenting some synonyms for sure. For effervescent, you're choosing synonyms. Oh, here's pop. Thank you, Pete Cross. There, you're presenting some synonyms for the word effervescent, and particularly you're picking synonyms like fizzy and sparkly and bubbly that you think children will know. I don't know if I saw any antonyms in here. You can tell me if you did, but you know, something like flat would be maybe an antonym. And then I'm seeing examples, lots of examples that you've put into the chat here, right? So you're thinking of examples in children's lives, things that they may be familiar with that would be effervescent, like sodas and pop and Alka-Seltzer and so on. And I don't know if you have non-examples in here, but you know, if you did, oh, Werner's is another good example. If you did, the non-examples might be something, you know, like water or coffee or other things. So in the way that you approached teaching effervescent, what you were doing was you were relating the new to the known. You were relating this new word effervescent to known information. So as educators and as coaches, you're doing this all the time. This is a very fundamental, hopefully, way that you're providing research aligned instruction. Let's do one other where it's a little bit different. LaCroix, I'm drinking right now, yay. Aerophobia. So imagine that you were trying to teach this word to children. What, in a research supported way, what would you do? I'm seeing a lot of responses around morphology, looking for word parts or structural analysis, breaking it down, looking at Greek and Latin roots. Absolutely works really well for this word. Start with phobia. Yeah, so I think that's right. I think a lot of kids might be familiar with the word phobia, but probably not aerophobia. So you're kind of pulling that maybe to start. And then arrow, how would you help them with arrow? Any ideas in the chat? Great. I love Joey Lynn. Absolutely. So Spanish speakers are at a real advantage with this word. Absolutely, with cognate. So that would be a great place to go. Yep. Thinking about aeroplane, aerospace, aviation, right? So you'd really try to help children draw on any existing knowledge that they may have of arrow and variations on arrow, like in English AIR, to help. So again, this is a bit more of a structural analysis example, but it's the same sort of thing. You are taking what children already know, and you're relating the new, this word, to the known, right? So this is, as suggested, a core practice. What essentials do you think of when you think of what we've just been talking about? What essentials involve teaching new words? Yeah, so I agree. 7 is definitely there for sure. But yeah, there are some others there too, right? So morphology could certainly be a piece of what we do in Essential 5. I see Terry wrote Essential 2, and Tammy, I agree. Essential 2 as well has material related to this. In fact, one of my favorite Essentials videos is that teacher in, I think it's the Essential 2 videos, where she teaches the kids the word pedestal by working on the word ped. So yeah, so there are a number of essentials here that really fit. Oh yeah, an essential one, I see that case as well. So go ahead and, if you would, read what's on the screen. So no doubt this is, researchy speak, but it really stood out to me. In fact, I tweeted this, so apologies if anybody already read this in the tweet, but this to me really stands out just because the researchers are really speaking to what an enormously fundamental concept of cognitive science it is for people to take new information and connect that to existing information. So enter culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy and teaching. So I've placed here on the screen the founders of each of these ideas, culturally relevant pedagogy, and its very related concept of culturally responsive teaching. And in both of these ways of thinking about teaching and learning, there's also a heavy, heavy emphasis on relating the new to the known. That is drawing on what children already know, their cultural experiences, their cultural values, and using that as an important pedagogical tool. So on the screen, you'll see a figure from a report that may be useful to some of you, the Munoz report from 2020. I put the link, so when you get the slides, you'll be able to see. It's a sort of introductory piece on culture responsive teaching, but you see that they identify these 8 competencies for culture responsive teaching. And what I'd like you to do in your breakout rooms is I'd like you to think about which of these, go through each of these 8 competencies and think which ones of these have something to do with relating the new to the known. And then if you get through all 8 and you still have time in your small group, I'm going to give you about 15 minutes. If you still have time in your small group, then you can also be thinking about which of these competencies need particular attention in the setting or settings in which you're working. So those are your 2 discussion prompts. Now I'm going to show you that if you go into your agenda for today, and you scroll past the actual agenda to page 3, or no, sorry, what page is that? 5? You should see those 8 competencies. I pasted those in there along with the link. And then the discussion questions are listed right after the graphic. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you're seeing that in the agenda? Terrific. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to go off into your breakout areas, and let's see, could you come back at 105? Is that workable? 105? Okay. And I don't know, oh, Cecilia, the questions, if you keep scrolling past the graphic, you'll see the questions in the agenda. So Lisa and Annie and Aaron, do they know what to do now? Okay, great.
So Lisa, everyone's going into the agenda and finding their place in the breakout room. Is that
everybody needs to, can you did you put that in the chat? I'm leaving the room right now because I'm hosting one of the breakout rooms. Now how many people did you want
in the chat?
I'm sorry.
I'm not picky. I was thinking about chat. 4.
Okay, great. And we'll be back at 105.
Thank you, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So click on the link in the chat to find out where you're going to chat. And for those of you in a room with other people, we understand if you're not going to a virtual breakout room and you're turning and talking with those right by you. Thanks, Liberty, for putting them back in the chat.
And do you want to pause the recording? Do you think that's true? All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope that each of you felt like you were able to have a productive conversation. From what I've heard, there definitely were productive conversations going on. So that's wonderful. And thank you for engaging deeply with the content. So I want to sum up this whole first point by just saying, we know that relating the new to the known is a fundamental understanding from scientific research in psychology. It goes back decades. And we know that relating the new to the known is a fundamental precept of culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching. Therefore, culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching reflect this and other important findings from scientific research in psychology. That's the fundamental argument. So when you're having a conversation with people who are focused on science of reading or effective instructional practice and literacy and are ignoring culturally responsive or culturally relevant teaching, that's probably a problem, right? Because that's one of the ways that we actually enact the psychological principle of relating the new to the known. And on the other side, if there are, and I shouldn't say sides because they're not sides, but if you have people who are oriented toward equity pedagogy and they're not getting into the details of things like how do we teach vocabulary in a way that relates new to known, that's also a problem. So we really need to see these two as integrated, inextricably linked, and both important to providing effective instruction for children. All right, I'm going to turn now to the second of the three examples, and that's access to literacy foundational skills. So when we think of science of reading, maybe the first thing that comes to mind are literacy foundational skills. As I've already outlined, actual science of reading, as all of you know, and some of you advocate actively, isn't just about literacy foundational skills. It's about, all aspects of reading. But certainly people think of literacy foundational skills, and as a coaching network focused on K-3, we're certainly, needing to pay lots of attention to literacy foundational skills. So what I want to do here is to really dive in with literacy foundational skills and talk about some of the ways in which they're related to equity, certainly not all, but some. And I'm going to talk here in particular about laws against print literacy education. Let me start by giving some context. So literacy foundational skills education, or really print literacy of any kind, but certainly teaching children or adults to read and write words has been denied throughout history to many social groups, and that includes quite deliberately in the US, denied to African Americans. And so that context is important to understand. We're going to take a look at some primary source documents that are actually anti-literacy teaching or laws against teaching print literacy. And I'm doing that because I think it is good to really make us grapple with, actual primary source documents, real documents that existed in our country that were the law of lands in our country, as painful as that may be. Before I show you these primary source documents, I do want to provide some context. As many of you hopefully know, a very important point in our history as a country was Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. And this was an uprising of enslaved peoples against those who were enslaving them. And this rebellion sparked a big increase in laws that made it illegal to teach African Americans, enslaved or free, to read. Some of the laws also covered writing, so to read or to write. And so it's not that there weren't such laws before, but there was a massive increase in such laws in response to Turner's rebellion for the reason given in the second bullet there. So that's some of the context of what you're going to see. The language in these laws is very disturbing, so I wanted to, offer that. And of course, the documents themselves and what they're doing and saying is very disturbing. It should be very disturbing and upsetting to each and every one of us, but for some of us, it may be more disturbing than others. And if you would prefer to just step away for about a minute while I share these documents, please feel free to do that, or just mute and camera off would work just as well. So here's a real law from 1833 in Alabama. And to put this in context, like 1833 is less than 200 years ago. There are people alive today that are not more than 3 greats away, great generations away from this law. And the part that's most germane to this group is here, where it says that any person or persons who shall attempt to teach any free person of color, and I'll let you read the rest of this section. Hopefully you're seeing it there. So it was punishable by law in Alabama, punishable by a fine. It was illegal to teach any person of color, free or enslaved, to spell or to read or to write words. So literacy foundational skills instruction was essentially illegal for a portion of the population at that time. The other sections, if you've been reading on, have to do with reading and writing for one another, as also illegal at that time. And here's another document. This one is from 1847 in Missouri. So those of you who know your history well will know that the Missouri Compromise predated this document. And so in Missouri, there was a lot going on legally related to enslavement at this time. But I will read the part that is most relevant, again, to our conversations here. No person shall keep. So it's this section right here. So there was, again, it was illegal to create an educational structure like a school for the purpose of teaching children to read or write in the state of Missouri. And this was even less than years ago than the Alabama law I showed you. This was 1847. So we cannot undo the horrors that these laws and many, many, many others like them convey. But we can go to extremes now to ensure universal access to literacy foundational skills and other areas of literacy, obviously, but I'm focused right now on literacy foundational skills. So, that's what we can do now. So I'm going to talk about 8 ways that we can support more children in Michigan to have strong literacy foundational skills. And I'm going to ask you to do a little jotting here. So you could just even do this by number in a little phrase or two, but which of these 8 you think need additional attention in your setting? So the first of the 8 I'm going to share is the one that I think is least within our grasp, although we can all contribute to this, and that's policy shifts. So there are many policy shifts that could be made in Michigan that would increase the number of children who have access to strong literacy foundational skills, and in particular, that could help to support students from racially and ethnically marginalized groups to have more access to strong literacy foundational skills. And those would be shifts in things like the way that school funding occurs in this state, the ways that schools are staffed in this state, shifts in healthcare access and quality. And yes, these affect literacy. If you think about something like the impact of chronic ear infections on literacy development, shifts in economic conditions, lots of evidence that increasing or improving economic conditions improves literacy rates, and so on. So those are one. Number 2 through 8 are going to be things that are more just within the bounds of the classroom. So more small group meetings with the most expert literacy educator available. What do I mean by that? I mean more small group meetings with the teacher in the classroom rather than from, say, with, in most cases at least, with a paraprofessional or a volunteer. So meeting in small group more often with children who need more small group instruction. Providing very intentional instruction, observing carefully to see where children have strengths and where they have needs in literacy foundational skills, and responding to those strengths and needs. making sure that no matter what we're doing in literacy foundational skills, that we're making sure to connect it to meaning so that there's a meaningfulness there for children. Keeping our pacing brisk. I had to put this in because I'm just seeing in a lot of classrooms this year, just like very slow whole group phonics and spelling instruction, where it just, the pacing is really too slow for the kids in the room. You know, keeping things moving means you can do a lot more and keep usually kids more engaged. And then of course, bringing an asset orientation, I'll bring more about that later. So teaching what kids need to know is really a very crucial way that we can improve literacy foundational skills across our state. Early intervention is another really, am I in the right number? Yeah, good. Okay, early intervention is another really important tactic. And we've talked about before, and I think you all know that research strongly suggests that intervening earlier tends to be more efficacious than intervening later. So we don't wait till like third grade and then step in to try to support literacy foundational skills development. The schedule carefully here, though, also refers to not pulling children out of science and social studies, for example, in order to provide literacy intervention. That's counterproductive because of the importance of science and social studies knowledge and really knowledge of the natural and social world in general to children's later reading success. Framing the intervention positively. I can't tell you how often I'm in schools and the language is something like, you have to go with Miss Jones now. If you use that language, you have to go with Ms. Jones now, that right off the bat, that just sets that up in a negative way for children. And think of the difference it would make if we just said, you get to go with Ms. Jones now. Just that little tiny subtle change in wording could make a difference. And then keeping in mind the different areas of early intervention that interface with literacy foundational skills. So for many children, speech and language support is going to be really important for literacy foundational skills. Children who are showing signs of dyslexia are going to need a different intervention, not typically at least what speech and language pathologists or whatever they're called in your district, speech and language therapists provide. Sometimes it's occupational therapy, particularly around writing, right? If handwriting is really posing a major barrier or challenge for children in foundational skills, occupational therapy can be useful. Sometimes the school social worker or the school psychologist is going to be a useful ally in making sure that as many children as possible have strong literacy foundational skills. 5, partnering with families. Right. So we know from research that families in general are highly invested in children's success in school and including, of course, their literacy success. We have some reason from research to think that families of children from historically underrepresented racial, ethnic, and economic groups are actually more invested, not less invested, more invested in children's academic success. So partnering with them. Fortunately, we're getting some, what is happening here? I do not know. Fortunately, we are getting some computer adaptive literacy support tools now that actually look like they work for children. That's taken the field a while, but tools that if children engage with them in a computer-based setting, it can support their literacy foundational skills development, never as a replacement for these other things I'm talking about, like small group instruction with the teacher and intervention, but can be a supportive tool for those that have been shown to be effective in research. And then volunteers, again, never a replacement for interventionists or for the classroom teacher, but volunteers when really working with children when they would otherwise be alone or, working on their own or would otherwise be, for example, just working with peers. There is some considerable evidence actually that volunteers can be supportive of children's literacy foundational skills development. They can do things like just listen to children read and prompt them when they're stuck. They can do echo reading, as long as the volunteer is literate and can read with expression, echo reading is an option. playing phonics and spelling games. This would be for volunteers who are, have a little bit more training. So it depends, on where the volunteer is. Just helping children stretch words while they're trying to write, helping children use their alphabet linking chart for children in K and sometimes in 1, depending on what kind of linking chart you use, helping them to match sounds to spelling. Those are all really useful kinds of things that volunteers can do. And of course, formal volunteer training programs and formal volunteer approaches like reading partners are also definitely worth thinking of, that have been tested in research and shown to be effective. And the 8th strategy I wanted to share is just making sure that we're getting kids reading and rereading a lot. So children develop strong literacy foundational skills in part through instruction and in part through a lot of opportunities for application. I said reading here, of course, writing would be true as well. And I know you've heard a lot about writing this morning from both Dr. Mohammed and from Drs. Lallier and Lisa Brown. But here I just want to focus in on reading and rereading. And when we're talking about our kindergartners and to some degree our first graders, it's the rereading that is probably going to be the best use of time, because we know that just sort of general independent reading is not likely to be very effective. It's really supported reading and particularly rereading. This is a document I made for a curriculum I'm working on, and this is just different ways that kids could reread, so they can have a menu of these different ways of rereading just to make it a little bit more fun and have some variety in there. Reading in a cozy spot, reading with funny glasses, reading with a flashlight, reading with a partner. And this is something that's addressed quite a bit in the Literacy Essentials modules. So you're probably familiar with that from module 3. Reading in a silly voice. These are the voices that we've been using: alien voice, baby voice, monster voice, spooky voice, sportscaster voice, tortoise voice or turtle voice, singer voice, and sleepy voice. But of course, you could pick lots of other fun voices for kids to use. Reading to a stuffed animal, reading to a class pet or to a visiting pet, like a visiting dog or the like. Recording yourself reading, super popular with a lot of kids. Reading with just a fun pointer. Reading in a whisper, like a whisper phone. This I love watching. Read like a teacher, where the kids like imitate their teacher as they read aloud a book or reread a book that they've read. And reading all together, like choral reading. So those are some options there. Another way we can motivate rereading is by having children do their rereading, and we talk about this a little bit in the modules as well, but to do their rereading for the purpose of getting really smooth at reading something, so that they can read it to preschoolers that are in their building or in a nearby child care center, or that they can read to their friends and relatives at home, or they can read to a celebrity, which for young children, as you know, could be the principal or some other adult that are really admired in the school. They're like a celebrity to them. And they can also, record their reading more formally, like in Seesaw, so that other kids could access it through the Seesaw activity structure or the like. So which essentials of those 8 did we hit? Go ahead and put them in the chat. What essentials stood out to you as you thought about those different strategies for providing support, additional support for kids who need it for foundational skills development and literacy? Yep, I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 10. Yep. I'm scrolling here. I'm expecting to see 5. So hopefully somewhere 5 is in there as well. 8, absolutely, right? The rereading goes in 8 as well. Yeah, I agree, Dawn. Dawn's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we could add 8 and 10. So almost everything. And actually we talked about observation informing instruction, and that would be essential 9. So I think we got all 10 one way or another. And I did see a question in the chat I wanted to quickly address. Cecilia asked about well, some teachers are saying kids shouldn't reread because they're just memorizing, that way they're memorizing the text. So they always need to see unseen text. That's not, that position's not supported in research. There's a huge amount of scientific research on the benefits of rereading. So I think you just need to tell, gently share with teachers. Of course, children need opportunities to read texts they haven't read before, but rereading texts that they have read before is also very positive. Okay, great. So I want to make one more point here. If you could just read the quotation on the screen. And apologies if you've seen, this is one of my favorites, so you've probably seen me share it before, but it's just that with all of this, when we're focusing on helping more children to reach strong literacy foundational skills, we're focused not on like what's wrong with the kid. It's not quite the emphasis. It's what can we do better? What conditions can we share so that this child can achieve the literacy foundational skills goals that we have? So my summary here is access to literacy foundational skills is necessary, although definitely not sufficient for equity, right? We have a long and painful, dangerous, unacceptable, dehumanizing history of failing to provide literacy foundational skills instruction to all children. And if you're going to develop literacy foundational skills, you need effective instruction. Like we've all seen what happens when we go into classrooms and we don't know how to teach reading and writing properly, and children suffer. Therefore, effective literacy foundational skills instruction is necessary for equity. So again, you want to try to connect these two, see them as inextricably linked, not two movements that you're choosing between, for example. All right, I'm going to go through one more and then give you a chance to really process what you've been jotting, what I've been talking about in a pretty healthy sized breakout session. So what I want to talk about is differentiation. And in a way, we're already talking about differentiation, right? Because we're talking about additional supports that some children may need within a classroom and other children may not need within a classroom. But I want to go a bit deeper and broader with differentiation. So remember that, at least in the way that I define equity, and I think the way that most people define equity, it requires not that everybody gets the same literacy education, but that everybody gets the literacy education that they need in order to reach their full potential. We know from science of reading, from scientific research on reading, that there are a lot of individual differences in literacy development. That is, not everyone needs the same thing. You see different profiles. Researchers haven't settled on how many different profiles there are. So some people are, say there are 4, some people they say there are 6, some people they say there are 8, but definitely there are different profiles of literacy strengths and weaknesses for children. There's variations in how intense the instruction is that children need. And in Michigan, we tend to talk about that intensity in terms of tiers, right? Tier 3 intensity versus tier 2 intensity versus regular classroom instruction tier 1 intensity. There are external factors that can lead to individual differences in literacy development, like attendance, and then interests, what interests children, what they like doing. And so with all of these individual differences, it seems clear that to achieve equity, we would need to differentiate. We would need differentiation. And as many of you know, this review of research that I've shared previously does suggest benefits of differentiation. The tricky thing here is that for many teachers you work with, the line between differentiation and what I would call tracking is very blurry. Or put another way, for many teachers, differentiation just turns into tracking. So I'm really not talking here about differentiation by ability or by level. For example, in that same meta-analysis that I just cited, there were no studies that they found that supported level-based grouping as the way to differentiate. Okay, so tracking is really a very concerning practice. When we track children, what we often do is we maintain systemic inequities instead of disrupting them. And so we have to be very concerned about that. And I want to bring a report to your attention that really highlights this point about the dangers of tracking. This is a report from the Haas Institute. And if you look at the authors here, these are highly respected people in our field: Tina Trujillo and Jabari Mahiri, Zeus Leonardo, Chris Gutierrez, Janelle Scott, Naila Nasir. These are folks who are deeply steeped in the research literature. And two of the key findings that they shared are the two that you'll see on your screen. And if you would just go ahead and take a moment to read those. So the reason I put both of these up here, I'm talking about tracking, so I think it's probably very obvious why I put the first one here. But the second one is very important because racial biases have been shown to affect tracking. That is, they affect who you end up putting in the low group to begin with, right? So these two things are actually really, really related. So when we're talking about differentiation with educators, we have got to guard very heavily against differentiation in the form of tracking or ability or level-based grouping. We've got to be flexible so that we move children from one target to another as needed. We group flexibly based on kids' interests, based on the choices they're making, maybe based on the goals that they have, based on very specific instructional targets at that moment. And we can put kids together who need the same instructional target, like all of these children need to review some of the major consonant digraphs, but we can also group by complementary strengths and needs, where, you know, put together a group of kids where maybe a couple of them need reinforcement in major consonant digraphs, and the other ones really need more support around retelling. And, you know, so children are sort of playing off of each other's strengths and needs. So what essential primarily comes to mind when I share this about grouping flexibly, grouping not by ability and level, but by observed and assessed needs? And yes, I'm seeing a lot of threes. And that was also what I was thinking, that this is really most tightly connected. It's not unconnected to other essentials, but I agree with those of you in the chat that it really most heavily connects to essential 3. So a couple of reminders related to this. The first is that children do not have to be reading or writing the same text to be in a small group for instruction. I know you all know this, but I just feel like a lot of teachers are just not there. Like, so they think if they're in a reading group together, they have to all be reading the same text at that moment, or they all have to be writing like the same thing. Although, to be honest, I don't see all that much small group writing instruction of any kind. The second reminder I want to offer is that there are ways to support all readers to write or read the same text. We do this with writing, with interactive writing, right? All the children are working together collaboratively with the teacher to produce a single text. So that's an example of how we do it in writing, but we can do it in reading as well. So let's say that you have a group of children and they're all going to read the same text. And for some children, that text is going to be much more challenging than for other texts. What could you do? So I'm going to give you 7 things you can do. And I'm going to ask you to do a little jotting about which of these 7 need additional attention in the district or districts in which you work. Okay. So one thing you can do is take some of the kids who are going to read that book in small group a little bit earlier and give them a little extra instruction in some of the orthographic patterns or specific words within the book. So you can think about whether that's something you've seen. You can give some children a chance to reread that book more times than others, either before or after the instructional moment. You could read aloud the book first and really help children get their minds around the book. This will work better with older children. With younger children, there is probably too much of a danger of memorization, but with older children, you could read aloud and then read it again later. So those are 3. Selective reading. So you can ask yourself if you've seen this, where let's say that the text said the child was hot, she wanted a fan. And let's say that in your group, you have a child who's really decoding at the consonant, vowel, consonant stage of reading development, if you will. It's not really a stage, but they're mainly reading consonant, vowel, consonant words. You might invite that child to read the word hot or to read the word fan, and you as a teacher or partner might read the other parts of that sentence. So that's selective reading. So they still participate in the reading, even though maybe they're not quite at a point where they're going to realistically be able to decode child or wanted. You can do echo reading, which we've talked about, partner reading, which you know well from Essential 3. And you can make sure that you're building on each child's strengths, including their linguistic repertoire. So for some children, for example, maybe what makes sense is that they get to read that book in Spanish first, and then they tackle it in English in small group. Or for some children, providing the opportunity for them to think about cognates related to some of the key words that are in the text might be a really good strategy. So these are all just different ways of supporting a range of learners to be able to work with the same text, instead of the feeling that so many teachers seem to have, that you have to have different kids reading different texts, and you've got your high text and your medium text and your low text. So trying to move away from that model. So the argument here is that differentiation of literacy instruction can be a tool for inequitable literacy education. That is, differentiation can both help us with equity, but it can also hurt us in terms of equity through such dangerous practices as tracking. And so when we differentiate, we must differentiate, but we must differentiate carefully. So it's both of those pieces. So again, the challenge I was trying to address in this presentation is the challenge of a feeling of separateness that I think I'm experiencing. I think some others are experiencing sometimes in discourse in our field, where it seems like people are either talking about equity or they're talking about science of reading or effective instruction, but not both. And I've argued those are inextricably linked. This is a model. You don't have to love this model, no problem. But just as a walk down memory lane, this is a model I shared with you, I don't know, I think about a year ago, where what it tries to convey, this one is about comprehension instruction rather than literacy foundational skills instruction. But what you can see here is this idea that you need this overall effective general classroom instruction, motivation, language development, and you're placing some of this narrower instruction within that context. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I thought I'd bring it back out again. What I want you to do in your breakout is to address both a big picture thing and a little picture thing. And if possible, do try to get to both. So the big picture is, what strategies could you use rhetorically to help people see the inextricable links between literacy equity and effective literacy instructional practices? So how can you help people to see that you can't really do one without the other? Both are needed. And they can't even really be separated. So that's the big picture question. And then the smaller picture question is looking at the jottings that you did, and some of those areas where you said, you know, we need to pay more attention to this within the setting or settings in which I work. What are some of your next steps that you could engage in to make improvements in those specific areas? So you're going to go into breakout rooms, and I think what I was thinking, so you have a breakout until 2, but then 2 is your break time. So really you should come back at 2:15